At 4:17 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, 300 million phones buzz in the dark. The alert is terse, clinical, almost polite. Multiple incidents detected. Remain indoors. Await further instruction. Most people roll over and assume it's missiles, a radar blip, a military crisis unfolding in real time. They are wrong. The real weapon was not fired from a silo. It was signed in an office, recorded in a ledger, and deployed across the global financial system years before a single warhead was loaded. The world wants to believe that the Third World War begins in the Arctic sky, with hypersonic objects and interceptor missiles and generals on secure lines. That is the Hollywood version. That is the story they want you to believe. The balance sheet tells a different story. The war did not start at 4:17 a.m. It started the moment an empire owed more than it could ever repay, and decided to call that stability. It started the moment a government realized it could freeze an enemy's cash without firing a bullet, and called that diplomacy. This is not a story about missiles or submarines or Arctic air corridors. This is a story about insolvency, not the theatrical kind with courtrooms and bankruptcy filings, the silent kind, the kind where civilizations discover, too late, that sovereignty is nothing more than solvency. And by 10:43 that same morning, 6 hours after the first buzzing phone, the balance sheet of the entire post-war world order would begin to collapse. Every frozen reserve, every petrodollar agreement signed in the desert heat, every bond held in trust by an adversary's central bank, gone. Let that sink in before we go any further. For 30 years after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States constructed the most dominant financial empire in recorded history. It was not built with steel and blood alone. It was built with paper, specifically the paper that passed through every hand on earth, the American dollar. At its peak, the dollar accounted for 88% of all global foreign exchange transactions. Every barrel of oil, every container crossing every ocean, every soybean futures contract, all of it was priced in American currency. The world didn't just use the dollar. The world needed it to breathe. Think about the scale of that. From Germany to Ghana, from Brazil to Bangladesh, every sovereign nation held dollar reserves in American institutions. To trade internationally, you held dollars. To access credit, you held dollars. To survive as a functioning economy inside the global system, you held dollars. The United States Treasury was, in effect, the central bank of the entire planet. And Washington was not shy about what that meant. By the early 2000s, the dollar had become something more than currency. It was a weapon, sharper than any missile, more precise than any drone, capable of bringing a nation to its knees without a single soldier crossing a single border. The parades were magnificent. The aircraft carriers were awe-inspiring. The GDP charts climbed without pause, and the world looked on with a mix of envy and submission. But beneath the surface, the foundation was already rotting. The United States had not balanced its budget since 1969, except for 4 brief years in the Clinton era. By 2008, the national debt crossed $10 trillion. By 2020, it had doubled. By the eve of the first alert, it stood at $36 trillion, a number so abstracted from human experience that it had ceased to carry meaning for most people. $36 trillion. The empire that policed the world, that enforced the global financial architecture, that punished nations who disobeyed. That empire was, by any classical definition, insolvent. It survived only because everyone agreed to pretend it wasn't. That agreement had a name. They called it the rules-based international order, and like all agreements built on collective pretense, it had an expiration date. The weapon Washington deployed most aggressively in the decade before the alert was not a Tomahawk cruise missile. It was SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, a bureaucratic name for the most powerful financial chokehold ever assembled. Exclude a nation from SWIFT, and it cannot receive international wire payments. It cannot pay foreign suppliers. It cannot sell its exports through normal banking channels without elaborate and costly workarounds. In 2012, Iran was cut off from SWIFT. Its oil exports collapsed by 60% within 18 months. In February 2022, Russia was ejected from the system following its invasion of Ukraine. That was not a diplomatic decision. That was a declaration of financial war. Russia held approximately $600 billion in foreign currency reserves, the largest reserve stockpile of any nation on Earth relative to the size of its economy. With one stroke of a pen, 300 billion of those dollars, held in European and American banking institutions, were frozen, confiscated without a trial, without a treaty, without even the performance of due process. The Kremlin called it theft. The West called it sanctions. The ledger did not care what you called it. The money was simply gone. Here is where the trap snapped shut, because the weapon designed to contain Russia actually accelerated the very outcome it was built to prevent. China watched. China had always watched. And China concluded one thing with absolute cold precision. Any nation that holds its reserves in dollars holds them at America's pleasure, not its own. That lesson spread across the global South like a brush fire. Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states all began quietly pulling away from dollar dependency. Not dramatically, not in headlines, quietly. And then not so quietly by 2024. The BRICS nations, representing 45% of global economic output, were actively designing a shared reserve currency framework. Saudi Arabia had begun accepting Chinese yuan for oil contracts. India was settling bilateral trade with Russia in rupees. The petrodollar, the architectural keystone of American financial supremacy since 1974, was being dismantled, pipeline by pipeline, agreement by agreement. The antagonist in this story is not a general behind a blast-proof door. It is the United States Treasury Department, not because it was evil, but because it was addicted. Every sanctions order, every swift expulsion, every frozen reserve was another hit from the same drug. And each hit sent the same message to every nation on Earth. Your reserves are not safe here. Your sovereignty is conditional. Your financial future is subject to our political judgment. Nations heard that message. Nations acted on it. The descent was not sudden. It never is. It was architectural, the slow failure of load-bearing walls that everyone could see cracking, but no one wanted to admit were structural. In 2023, the global share of dollar-denominated reserves fell to 58%, the lowest recorded level in modern history. The dollar was still dominant. But dominance and monopoly are different animals. The monopoly was fracturing. In 2024, China and Russia completed a bilateral payment architecture that bypassed SWIFT entirely, running on their own financial rails. Annual trade volumes through the system reached $400 billion. The precedent was more dangerous than the number dot, the alternative infrastructure, now existed. And infrastructure, once built, fills up. The U.S. fiscal deficit for 2024 alone reached $1.8 trillion, not the cumulative debt. The single-year shortfall. Annual interest payments on the national debt crossed $1 trillion, exceeding the entire defense budget for the first time. America was borrowing new money simply to service the interest on money it had already borrowed. That is not a superpower. That is a man paying one credit card with another, and then came the morning of the alert. At 3:54 a.m., a radar signature materialized over the Arctic. Fast-moving, high altitude, NORAD scrambled. The Pentagon woke the Secretary of Defense. The President received the call. The conversation lasted 47 seconds. Nobody in that conversation mentioned the balance sheet. Nobody ever does in those 47 seconds. But in the financial world, something else was already happening. Asian markets had opened hours earlier. Tokyo, Shanghai, Hong Kong, all three had already recorded unusual overnight options activity, spiking across defense stocks, energy commodities, and long-duration government bonds. Someone knew, or someone was betting that someone else was about to act. In finance, the distinction barely matters. The money had already moved. At 4 a.m. Eastern, the futures market for West Texas Intermediate crude oil surged 14% in under 4 minutes. 14%. In 4 minutes. That does not happen by accident. That is an informed position. That is capital being repositioned for a world in which oil pipelines are no longer reliable. By 4:17 a.m., when the alert reached 300 million phones, the yield on the U.S. 10-year Treasury bond had already jumped 22 basis points in overnight trading. Gold had spiked $800 per ounce across Asian exchanges. The financial system knew what was happening before the public did, and the financial system was hemorrhaging. By 5:30 a.m., as military forces across 3 continents began mobilizing along fault lines that had been building for a decade, S&P 500 futures were signaling a 31% opening decline. Think about what that number means in human terms. 1/3 of all recorded American corporate wealth evaporated before the New York Stock Exchange opened its doors, before a single confirmed combat engagement had been announced to the public. At 6:21 a.m., an American naval vessel in the Baltic Sea fired cruise missiles that struck a radar installation on Russian territory. 17 Russian servicemen died in the explosion. 17 lives. But in the bond markets, it was a different kind of detonation entirely. Traders in London, already at their desks, already watching in disbelief, began asking aloud the question that had been unthinkable for 80 years. Are American Treasury bonds still the world's safe haven asset? If the United States is in direct kinetic conflict with a nuclear power, where exactly is the safe harbor? For the first time since 1945, the answer was genuinely uncertain. The smoking gun in this story is not a missile. It is a document, Executive Order 14,024, signed on April 15, 2021, which authorized the United States government to freeze the financial assets of any foreign entity deemed to pose a threat to American national security. No judicial review, no appeal to international courts, no treaty ratification. American political judgment alone. That order was the foreclosure notice on the rules-based order as it had existed. It stated openly that American financial power was discretionary. That access to the dollar system was a privilege that could be revoked. It was the liquidation notice for the fiction that American-controlled financial infrastructure was neutral ground. Russia read it. China read it. Every nation with reserves denominated in dollars read it and began, quietly, to hedge. By the morning of the alert, Russian state gold reserves had climbed to over 2,300 metric tons, the fifth largest national gold stockpile on Earth. That accumulation did not happen overnight. It was a deliberate, decade-long repositioning by a nation that had looked at the balance sheet and reached a rational conclusion. Paper held in an adversary's banking system is not an asset. It is a hostage. When the Baltic exchange of fire occurred, when American cruise missiles made confirmed contact with Russian soil, Moscow's response operated simultaneously on two tracks. One track was military and visible. Mobilize, escalate, prepare for the next engagement. The other track was financial and almost invisible. Within 40 minutes of confirmed impact, Russia announced a complete suspension of all natural gas pipeline deliveries to Western Europe, effective immediately. $44 billion in annual energy revenue, severed cleanly, instantly. 11 European nations that had been sourcing between 30 and 60% of their industrial energy from Russian pipelines were suddenly staring into an economic void. Not a military void, a financial one. Factories would begin shutting down within 72 hours without alternative supply. Hospitals would shift to emergency protocols. The cascade would not be nuclear. It would be economic, cold, grinding, and irreversible long before any missile found a target. That was the real first strike, not the interceptors over Alaska, ledger entries in Moscow. By 9 a.m., the global financial system was experiencing what would later be described as the single worst 4-hour trading session in the history of recorded markets. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 4,100 points before circuit breakers suspended trading entirely. The London Stock Exchange had already halted. The euro had fallen below parity with the dollar for the first time since 2002 and was still falling. Oil had crossed $212 per barrel. But the real catastrophe, the structural one, the existential one, was happening in the sovereign bond markets. The United States carries $36 trillion in sovereign debt. That debt is held by pension funds, insurance companies, foreign central banks, and sovereign wealth funds across every continent. Every single holder of that paper operates on one foundational assumption: America always pays. American bonds are as close to riskless as any investment on Earth. The dollar is the bedrock. By 10 a.m., that assumption was dying in real time. Foreign central banks, led by China's People's Bank, which held $850 billion in U.S. Treasury securities, began selling, not in panic, not dramatically. Methodically, the position was being reduced. The exit had begun. When foreign central banks sell treasury bonds, yields rise. When yields rise, American borrowing costs rise across the entire debt structure. A single percentage point increase in the average yield on $36 trillion of debt costs $360 billion additional dollars annually, simply in interest. By 10:43 a.m., exactly 6 hours after the first alert, Treasury yields had risen 112 basis points from their pre-dawn levels. That is not a market correction. That is a financial nuclear strike. America was now facing an implied annual debt service increase exceeding $400 billion. In a single morning, sovereignty is solvency. And for the first time in 80 years, America's solvency was no longer beyond question. The president sat in the Situation Room surrounded by generals and cabinet secretaries. They spoke of submarines and bombers and launch windows and intercept timelines. They did not speak of bond yields. They never do. But the bond yields were the real countdown clock in that room, the one nobody was watching. Because the brutal arithmetic that nobody said aloud was this: a nation that cannot finance its debt cannot finance a war. A nation that cannot finance a war has already lost it, regardless of the warheads pointed at the Arctic sky. The gold was leaving the system. The credit was freezing. The Allies were running their own calculations. 3 truths, 3 facts, 3 tombstones for the unipolar moment. Wars always end. The bills never do. Britain fought the First World War from 1914 to 1918, 4 years. It made its final war debt payment to the United States in December 2006. 88 years of installments for 4 years of conflict. Let that register as a human fact, not just a historical footnote. The economic wreckage from a conflict between nuclear superpowers, even one that remains conventional, even one that de-escalates before a warhead is launched, would dwarf anything in the historical record. The physical infrastructure damage from limited strikes alone would reach into the trillions. The global supply chain disruption, food, medicine, semiconductors, rare earth materials, energy, would produce economic contractions that would compound across decades before anything resembling recovery emerged. But the deeper damage is systemic. The dollar-based financial architecture constructed at Bretton Woods in 1944 was the invisible infrastructure of post-war prosperity. Every trade agreement, every development bank loan, every IMF stabilization program, all of it rested on one assumption: that the dollar was neutral, that it was money, not a weapon. That assumption did not survive the first 6 hours. The sanctions experiment, freeze their reserves, expel them from SWIFT, weaponize the currency, was designed to project power without pulling a trigger. Instead, it taught half the world to build a parallel financial system, an architecture that does not require the dollar, one that, once complete and operational, permanently fragments the global economy into competing spheres, dollar-dependent and dollar-independent. The generation born in the aftermath of that morning will inherit a world divided not just militarily, but financially.